Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Michael Hernandez. We attended a border summit in El Paso in August featuring leaders from the U.S. and Mexico. At the time, there were concerns about whether there would be a new trade agreement to replace Nafta. Since then, another agreement is in place, but questions remain over the relationship between the two countries. Take a look. U.S. and Mexican political and economic leaders met in El Paso for the 2018 U.S.-Mexico Border Summit hosted by the Border Plex Alliance, which includes Las Cruces, El Paso, and Mexico's Ciudad Juarez. The summit featured former Mexican President Ernesto Zedillo as its keynote speaker and included talks from understanding North America as a single market to border infrastructure to the future of U.S.-Mexican relations. Texas Democratic Representative Beto O'Rourke, who is challenging incumbent Republican Senator Ted Cruz in November's midterm elections, says there's no relationship more important to the United States and to Texas economically than with Mexico.
There are 1 million jobs in this state that depend on the U.S.-Mexico relationship. Culturally, historically, economically, in who our families are in this binational community. Mexico is not just a part of our past, it's not just who we are today. We have a shared future together, and the sooner we start acting that way as a country, the better that future will be. So we actually have a great set of conditions today. We just need to be mindful of that and ensure that they are good going forward.
According to the Federal Trade Representative's Office, U.S. goods and services trade with Mexico totaled about $617 billion in 2017, making Mexico the United States' third largest trading partner. But that major trade partnership has not led to stronger diplomatic ties under the Trump administration. Since taking office, President Trump has literally and figuratively worked to build walls instead of bridges with Mexico. Trump's zero-tolerance immigration policy that separated more than 2,000 children from their parents is a situation O'Rourke says the Trump administration needs to do more to rectify.
The Trump administration, and one person in particular, Donald J. Trump, has inflicted unimaginable cruelty and inhumanity to our fellow humans. And so there's far more for them to do. There's far more for each one of us to do to ensure that that administration, our elected representatives, feel the pressure of the people of this country to make sure that we do the right thing, not just for those asylum seekers and those families, but for this country, for our values, for who we are. I, for one, want to make sure that we do that.
Mayors from the Borderplex region spoke about their experiences governing in the world's largest binational community. El Paso Mayor Dee Margo says the biggest strength of the Borderplex is that it's one bilingual, bicultural region where strong trade is critical.
We're the 10th largest exporter to Mexico through our port here. And we have 50,000 jobs here in El Paso tied to the maquila manufacturing operations in Juarez. And the ratios are for every 4 jobs in Juarez, there's 1 job in El Paso. So if it can continue to be expanded and grow, it benefits us. It's the entire region.
Margo says what doesn't benefit the region are President Trump's calls for a border wall.
We have a fence here. We have a fence. It works. It was designed originally for criminal elements and those things, car thieves, things like that. It works fine. It was done during the Bush administration. To say the wall and add that rhetoric to it and emotion, to me, conjures up the Berlin Wall. We're not a Berlin Wall here. We need to protect our borders. We're a sovereign nation. Mexico's a sovereign nation. We need to work through that. But this whole concept of a wall, I think, is misplaced rhetoric, and it's too harsh, and it serves no useful, positive purpose in my mind.
As renegotiations to the North American Free Trade Agreement continue, former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico James Jones says Nafta has been positive for the country's growth.
We've added new jobs. We've increased our domestic economy. We have established relationships on a personal basis with Mexicans and Canadians that we didn't have before. So all of these things wrapped into one means we're a better country for it, and we have better neighbors for it.
Jones says he thinks leaders in Washington, D.C. should join the border Plex in recognizing the value of trade to the region and avoid policies that negatively impact economic output.
Both with the Congress and with the President, with the White House. I think the President is operating in a way that does not take into account the business and the economic consequences of his actions. And unless business lets him know that, he's going to continue to act in an erratic way that hurts our country.
But critics point to an annual trade deficit with Mexico since NAFTA was established in 1994. The federal government reported that trade deficit totaled more than $64 billion in goods and services in 2017. It's a reminder that President Trump and others may continue to renegotiate trade deals while also reducing immigration. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Michael Hernandez. Again, since we released that report, the U.S. has reached a new agreement waiting for Congress to approve. With me to speak about the importance of our trade relationship with Mexico and what the agreement means for New Mexico and the Borderland is Jerry Pacheco, president of the Border Industrial Association. Jerry, thanks for joining us on the show.
My pleasure, thank you.
So let's talk about our trade relationship with Mexico. How does it impact us both as Americans and as New Mexicans?
Well, Mexico is one of our biggest trading partners. I mean, Mexico buys more of what the United States makes. It's only behind China. So our trading relationship's good, and trade foments diplomacy. So trading companies that are good trading partners usually are very good neighbors, and they're very good partners. At the local level, we have a booming border. We're industrializing New Mexico's border with Mexico, and that would not have been possible if NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, had not been in place. So the resolving of the renegotiations means quite a bit to us here, and that collective sigh of relief you hear from the border is from people that are saying, finally, the uncertainty is going to go away. We're going to have some ground rules to play with here.
How much more important would you say that our relationship with Mexico is than our relationship with Canada, just because we're a border state?
Oh, it's much more. I don't want to demean the U.S. Mexico-Canadian relationship, but for New Mexico, we are only one of 4 states that share a border with Mexico. To us at the border, that's our biggest advantage. You can say we're good people in New Mexico, we're hardworking, we've got great incentives, we've got a good business climate. All of that is good. But the very fact that we share a border with Mexico opens up a lot of economic opportunities.
Now, we had a guest on our last show on Fronteras. He was the executive director of the Hunt Institute for Global Competitiveness at the University of Texas at El Paso. Now, you had some comments that you wanted to make about a report that was released.
Well, we didn't participate in that report. The industrial base was not contacted. We're not even quite sure what the nature of why that occurred. And it wasn't really a report. It was a bunch of statistics that originally had no text or any bearing whatsoever. And I'm not sure if the Hunt Institute went out to try to become an expert on Santa Teresa, but it ended up confusing people more than anything, because a lot of bad data, a lot of sloppy data, and it was very, very, it was so bad that the chairman of the Doña Ana County Commission, Ben Rossin, publicly called for the Hunt Institute to apologize for saying that the county or anybody else in New Mexico was involved in that. So we disavow ourselves of that study 100%.
Okay. Now, in recent news, Canada recently agreed to trade negotiations with the U.S., joining Mexico back in August, and we finally have a new trade agreement to replace NAFTA. It's called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. Doesn't flow quite as well off the tongue as NAFTA, but it's about the details that's important.
Correct.
So now that all 3 countries have agreed, what are some of the highlights of this new agreement?
Well, it's an interesting agreement here. First of all, it's a 16-year agreement, okay, with 6-year review periods. So that's good, because the United States originally was proposing a 5-year agreement with the sunset, then a renegotiation. So that's very good. You've got content issues in this. Automobiles built in North America now are going from a 62.5% North American content requirement to a 75%. I don't know any auto producers that are at that 75%, so that's going to be a target that they're going to have to go after. Trucks, whether they're regular trucks or light trucks, another provision is that 40 to 45% of the North American content of those trucks has to be made by workers earning more than $16 an hour. So the content requirements for us are the most important thing. But most of NAFTA that was negotiated and implemented in '94, 34 chapters, in this agreement, there's 12 side letters. Most of what is in the USMCA preserves the old NAFTA.
Let's dig in a little bit into the stats that you just mentioned. Now, how does increasing domestic requirements, how does that impact both auto manufacturers as well as the employees, bumping that North American content rate from 62.5% to 75%?
Well, the hope in the United States and on behalf of our negotiators is that we'll see a lot of that industry come back and reshore to the United States, and that may happen to a limited extent. However, I think that there's going to be quite a bit of production out there that is not going to want to come to the United States to $16 an hour labor just to get in under that requirement. They'll probably simply just pay the tariff on bringing a good that's not meeting that requirement to the United States.
So would that necessarily not translate into more jobs here in the U.S., or could it also possibly raise the situation of less demand for American cars and then higher prices?
Well, let me take your latter point first. Yeah, American cars, if enough suppliers to the automotive industry come back to the United States, or they use $16 an hour labor, our cars are going to be more expensive to Americans and to the rest of the world. So that could result in a competitive disadvantage. I think we deal with supply chains every day at the border, and it's not that easy to automatically switch a supply chain. You've got tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. And to change your supply chain to meet a requirement like that, there's going to be whole supply chains that just decide, let's just pass that cost on down the line, and it'll eventually get to you and I, the consumer.
How does the USMCA agreement also affect energy? Energy was also a big part of the restructuring, especially for Mexico, you had mentioned.
Oh yes, because Mexico, under the current presidential administration, one of its big accomplishments has been to privatize what was a nationalized energy industry. And so when NAFTA was negotiated, Mexico did not allow a foreign investment by constitution in its energy industry, particularly in the petroleum industry. And so the new USMCA addresses that, and there's provisions protecting let's say Americans that want to go in to Mexico's energy industry and try to sell their products or their services or what have you. So that's addressed there. Digital is addressed in the new USMCA. When NAFTA was negotiated, the social media and the worldwide net was a fraction of what it is now. And so there's provisions that protect products that are digitally made from being tariffed or what have you. There's even stuff in the USMCA that beef up intellectual protections on, for example, on drug patents, on pharmaceuticals, for example. These are all good things. NAFTA was tweaked, and I think I've never met a person during this whole process that said, no, let's not relook at the agreement. You've got to look at agreements periodically. I'm just not sure if the way we went about strong-arming our two closest trading partners, and sometimes in even a demeaning way. I mean, with the whole tiff between President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada, I don't know how that affects us going forward from an economic standpoint, because good economic relationships beget good diplomacy. And we need partners. I mean, the United States is not an island in the world. We're interconnected with everybody else in the world. So that worries me a little bit going forward, how that affects us with our two closest allies.
Let's talk about tariffs. Now, as of this taping, the Trump administration's tariffs on imported steel and aluminum from Canada and Mexico, as well as their tariffs in retaliation, those are still in place. So how have you seen those tariffs affect trade in the border Plex region?
That has been, even more than the uncertainty over the Nafta renegotiations, the tariffs have had more of an effect. We run a program called the International Business Accelerator. It's part of the New Mexico Small Business Development Centers network. So we go out and counsel and help companies break into global markets. And we support the companies that are already in New Mexico with a trade connection with Mexico. We are a big automotive manufacturing base in New Mexico, and people look at me like I'm from the moon when I say that. We've got.
Can you give us a sense of scale?
Of course. I mean, we've got companies in the steel industry. We've got companies in plastic injection, electronics, foam, copper wire, harness, cable that goes into the harness industry, for example. We are a supply base to Mexico's automotive industry. And you can't look at a supply base as being black and white. Products are being made that go into Mexico that incorporate multiple components from all over the world. And some of those components were Chinese steel and aluminum. And so we have companies that were using that because they're not readily available in the United States. And in spite of the tariffs, you can't ramp up overnight a steel mill or aluminum mill. And all of a sudden that caused them to encounter competitors that never would have been in their markets before because they weren't suffering the same type of tariffs. Or they were suffering shortages because everybody's scrambling for any excess capacity outside of China that they could access. So it was a tumultuous period. And I know for the steel companies in Santa Teresa, yes, it's good that the NAFTA was renegotiated. We have a set of playing rules, but the tariffs going forward are still going to affect them.
And not just those tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, but the Chinese tariffs in general. Over $200 billion worth of tariffs are in place
in the latest round.
In this latest round, in this trade war with China. How does that affect lower income populations when they go and shop at places that sell primarily Chinese-made goods?
Well,
go ahead.
And you're right. I mean, the most vulnerable and some of the poor sectors of our economy, the people operating in the poverty level, have to shop at places like Dollar Tree, Family Dollar. I shop there because it's close to my house.
So
okay, but
they're not a sponsor, by the way. Yeah.
But whether a Chinese pair of sandals is going to cost $3.99 instead of $2.99, it's inconsequential to me. But if you're limited in your revenues and in your household revenues, and you're shopping at Family Dollar, which has probably a third of its products, if not more, are made in China, you're the one that's going to be hit with those tariffs. I can go to another place and it's not going to affect me that much, even if I pay a little more money. But there are a lot of people that are going to be directly affected by the latest round of tariffs on Chinese-made goods that are sold in American retail stores.
So instead of a Dollar Tree, it could end up being a $2 or $3 tree.
A $5 tree or something.
$5 tree.
Yeah, and you see that all the time. You see families with kids in the store trying to stretch their dollar. And so if they're going to pay 30% more now on products that they're continuously consuming, that's a lot to ask people that are struggling to be challenged with.
Now, you hear about this all the time, but it's that the U.S. is constantly facing a trade deficit. Last year, according to U.S. Census Bureau data, combined goods and services, we had a trade deficit of roughly $64 billion. Is that necessarily a negative thing? Is that something that's negatively impacting the U.S., having a trade deficit? Because that just means you imported more than you exported, but is that a bad thing?
Not necessarily. I mean, there's a net outflow of money, capital, if you're importing more than you're exporting. But think of it this way. You go out and you buy a house. You take out a mortgage on a house. You're in debt. You're paying a lot. You're paid, unless you can pay for that house cash, you're on a mortgage and you're paying against that mortgage. It's a long-term thing. But the quality of your life has risen. Now you have a place to go. You relax. You can grow vegetables in your yard. You can raise a family. Same concept with the U.S. trade deficit. A lot of developed countries run trade deficits because it's cheaper to buy our consumer products like television sets, like iPhones, like cars in many instances, from a place they can be more cheaply, or I should say economically, produced. And then we have money then for other things. The less we're paying for iPhones, the less we're paying for automobiles, we can now afford a bigger house. We can now send our kids to a better school. We can now buy better clothes. We can now invest in the stock market better. So a trade deficit necessarily isn't a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But when the United States consumer ends up getting out of control and we incur a lot of personal consumer debt, that's when it becomes a major issue. And I don't know how you ever address that, because unless you can ask the U.S. consumer to spend 50% less on iPhones, on stuff from Europe, China, and Mexico, that's not going to go away in the foreseeable future, in spite of the tariffs.
That's a tall order to fill.
It is.
What do you make of the USMCA agreement personally? Is it good for all three countries involved? Is it bad, or is it better for one country and worse for the other, or is it more of a wash?
No, I mean, because most of NAFTA was preserved under the new USMCA, I think my personal feeling is I'm glad it's done, because the uncertainty over whether it was going to get done, the uncertainty whether Canada would join us, because the U.S. and Mexico, came to terms before, that was all preying on our minds at the border, because you got to have a set of rules to play by. And for me personally, it worried me, because if that went away, or we came out with this agreement that was not good, how could we keep attracting all this investment that we're getting to the border? Now that the dust is settling, we have a playing field, we have the rules of the game, it's going to be easier for us to go out and say, look, don't even worry about that. We can place you here, do your business, and let's go forward with our lives.
And so can you talk to me just a little bit about, in terms of how do we look at this going forward, in terms of, let me rephrase this. How are we going to look at this agreement going forward, because technology seems to move at such a rapid pace? Is there an expiration date on this new agreement, and how often does it get reviewed? How does it get reviewed, essentially? 16
years right now out of the gate is the new USMCA. There's 6-year review periods. And exactly, I mean, so many things in our modern world can change in 6 years, can change in 12 years. And so those are little windows to look back at the agreement and say, well, we probably should tweak this, we probably should tweak that. 16 years is a good time period to allow for foreign direct investment, especially here on the border. 5 years was not. I mean, what the U.S. was proposing was unmanageable. 16 years is a good time period. And I think going forward, the three partners, if you bring us together every 6 years, we can work out the kinks in the agreement and deal with the unforeseen that we can't see right now, but in 6 years might be an issue.
Ultimately, what industries do you see the USMCA affecting the state of New Mexico the most in terms of its industries?
Automotive industry, consumer electronics. Because we're an automotive base, particularly in Santa Teresa, our little corner of the state has 0.001% of the state's entire population. Santa Teresa accounts for 53% of New Mexico's total exports to the globe. So it affects us a lot down there. So the automotive industry, consumer products industry, since we have suppliers to those industries. The other industry is the dairy industry, because under
dairy,
under USMCA, Canada agreed to raise the access to its dairy market to its North American partners from 3.25% to 3.59%. Now, the U.S.-Mexico Chamber of Commerce estimates that'll result in $70 million. That's not a lot for a nation, $70 million. But New Mexico is one of the nation's biggest dairy producers, so we can get a piece of that. And that should be good news for our dairy producers.
Well, is there anything else that we haven't covered? We've covered most of the main points, but is there anything else that doesn't really get talked about in the conversation when we're talking about a massive, well, actually, can we call it a massive overhaul? Is it a new agreement, or is it more of a revamped agreement?
It's a tweaked agreement.
Okay.
I understand how agreements become embroiled in politics, but it was a retweaking and an updating of an agreement that's 24 years old, okay? It's nothing ground shaking in terms of groundbreaking in terms of, oh my God, the world's changed because we did this and this and this. It's a tweaking of an old agreement. What I think is now this allows for is that we did have companies, particularly smaller companies, bigger corporations can wade through uncertainty, and this uncertainty over the USMCA or the renegotiation. They could wade through this because they have so much capital. And if they're expanding, they got to expand. And if they got to contract, they got to contract. It's easy for them because they have the capital and the resources. The medium to smaller mom and pop suppliers to industry don't have that capital. So going through this uncertain period, they can risk their whole future by expanding a plant, then finding out that the agreement never got renegotiated and what have you. So what we've seen is a lot of the medium-sized suppliers avoided any major expansions. They avoided hiring employees that they would have in the course of their business. Now that the dust is settled, and granted it has to go to Congress and all the rest of the process, and hopefully that'll be smooth, but now they can start looking at the future and saying, we're going to expand, we're going to hire more workers. And then for New Mexico, that's great. We can expand plants, and then we can attract more suppliers to our border that supply the Mexican industrial base.
Well, we'll see how this plays out going forward, and hopefully that it's a positive thing for all three countries.
We're looking at this very positively, and I think New Mexico and the border region has a beautiful, bright future, and we're going to take advantage of it.
Perfect. Well, Jerry, thank you so much for coming on the show. We appreciate it. And thank you for being with us on Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Michael Hernandez. We'll see you next time.